In October 1994, a BBC producer put concerns about Jimmy Savile in writing. The letter was filed under staff gossip and never acted upon. 6 years earlier, a hospital nurse noted in her diary that his behavior on the ward felt overly familiar. She never reported it. Across 4 decades, colleagues, friends, and frontline staff each saw something, and each stayed silent. When the police finally investigated, they identified more than 200 victims. This is not a story about one man's crimes. It is about the loyalty, fear, and institutional machinery that made silence feel like the only option. In June 1964, the BBC's head of light entertainment, Bill Cotton, signed off on a contract that would change the face of British television. Jimmy Savile, then a rising disc jockey, was brought in to present the new show, Top of the Pops. Cotton's production notebooks from that summer describe Savile as tireless, noting his punctuality at weekly rehearsals and a work ethic that set him apart from other hosts. Internal memos praised his ability to connect with young audiences and his knack for keeping the show running smoothly. There was no mention of concerns or complaints, only admiration for a presenter who seemed to embody the BBC's drive for innovation. This early endorsement did more than launch a television career. It gave Savile extraordinary access to the BBC's studios, corridors, and staff. Cotton's approval, recorded in those production notes, carried weight throughout the organization. For producers and junior staff, Savile's presence became part of the fabric of weekly production. His name appeared regularly in call sheets and internal schedules, signaling that he was not just another guest, but a fixture. The machinery of celebrity in the 1960s relied on trusted relationships. Cotton's personal oversight meant that Savile was seen as safe, reliable, and above reproach. When a star received that level of institutional trust, it shaped how others responded to him. Questions about behavior or boundaries were less likely to surface when a presenter had the visible backing of senior management. As Savile's profile grew, so did the sense that he was untouchable within the BBC's ecosystem. The normalization of his presence extended beyond the studio. Staff who worked on Top of the Pops in its early years recall that Savile's access was almost unrestricted. He moved freely between rehearsal rooms and backstage areas, often staying late after filming. Cotton's notes reflect a belief that such dedication was a sign of professionalism, not something to be questioned. This early pattern of access granted and boundaries blurred would echo through the decades, shaping the unspoken rules that governed how colleagues interacted with Savile. Authority, once bestowed, became a shield. For many, the decision to trust was made long before any rumors or doubts could take hold. By the mid-1970s, Jimmy Savile's reputation as a charitable figure was cemented not just by press coverage, but by the very structure of his television work. Programs like Jim'll Fix It, which aired from 1975 to 1994, regularly featured Savile fulfilling wishes for children in settings that included hospital wards and special care units. The format blurred the line between entertainment and philanthropy. Savile was shown orchestrating surprises for sick children, handing out gifts, and chatting with nurses and doctors. These televised visits went beyond scripted scenes. Production notes from hospital episodes list real NHS staff and patients, with Savile moving freely through restricted areas, sometimes after regular visiting hours. The show's producers, including those named in BBC call sheets from the 1980s, coordinated closely with hospital administrators and charity trustees to stage these events. Savills' charity work extended off-screen as well. In 1972, he chaired the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children Gala at the Royal Albert Hall, appearing alongside trustees such as Sir John Paul Getty II. Newspaper listings from that year describe him as the driving force behind the event, with his name featured prominently on the program. Trustees and hospital board members were photographed with Saville at these galas, reinforcing his image as a tireless benefactor. For many in the charity sector, his presence meant access to major donors and royal patrons. This public persona acted as a powerful shield. Staff members and junior producers who might have felt uneasy about Saville's conduct found themselves up against a narrative of selfless service. Questioning his behavior risked appearing to undermine the very charities and hospitals that depended on his fundraising. In interviews conducted decades later, frontline nurses and charity volunteers described a sense of hesitation. Saville was the face of their cause, and any doubts about his actions seemed almost disloyal. The effect was to create an environment where scrutiny was discouraged. The more visible Saville's charity work became, the more difficult it was for those around him to voice concerns. Program producers, charity trustees, and hospital administrators all played a part, sometimes knowingly, sometimes by default, in reinforcing the idea that good deeds excused or explained away any troubling signs. The result was a culture where private access was granted in the name of public service, and the cost of speaking up felt impossibly high. Inside the BBC, legal caution became a silent partner to the culture of deference already surrounding Jimmy Savile. In December 2012, a memo from the BBC's legal counsel circulated among senior editors. The document advised that any inquiry about Saville should be met with a simple response: no comment. Behind that phrase stood the weight of UK libel law. The memo invoked the serious harm standard. Unless there was evidence strong enough to meet this legal threshold, staff were warned that publishing or even discussing allegations could expose the corporation to costly defamation claims. This guidance did not appear in isolation. For years, defamation law had placed the burden of proof on journalists, requiring them to establish the truth of any damaging claim. With the 2013 Defamation Act on the horizon, the BBC's legal department anticipated even stricter scrutiny. The December 2012 memo preemptively aligned the BBC's editorial policy with the new serious harm test, effectively raising the bar for any internal investigation or reporting. Freedom of information requests filed in the years since have failed to secure a full copy of the memo. The BBC maintains that legal advice is exempt from disclosure, citing statutory protections, yet the existence and language of the memo are confirmed in secondary sources. Excerpts seen by journalists recall explicit instructions. Unless the evidence could clearly demonstrate serious harm, the only approved response was silence. This legal shield had a chilling effect inside newsrooms. Editors and producers, already wary of challenging high-profile talent, now faced a formal risk calculation. Pursuing a story about Saville meant not just confronting a powerful colleague, but also risking personal liability and institutional backlash. The legal memo became a kind of invisible barrier, reinforcing the instinct to stay quiet. For staff who might have sensed something was wrong, the message was unmistakable. Loyalty to the organization now meant following legal advice, even if it meant ignoring uncomfortable questions. The threat of libel suits did not just protect Saville's reputation, it shaped the everyday decisions of those around him. turning legal caution into an unspoken rule. In this environment, the cost of speaking up was measured not just in personal risk, but in the very real possibility of career-ending litigation. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was engineered by a system that valued protection over transparency. A nurse's diary entry from March 1988 sits tucked inside a box of old visitor logs at St. Thomas Hospital. The handwriting is brisk, almost clinical. The entry reads, "Saville arrived early, children delighted, but he seemed overly familiar with nurses." There is no follow-up, no hint of alarm, just a quiet observation sandwiched between notes about medication rounds and a late lunch. For the nurse who wrote it, the moment was not dramatic, just another irregularity in a ward that had learned to accommodate exceptions. Saville's visits were always an event. He often arrived ahead of schedule, sometimes before the day staff had finished handover. The children, many of them long-term patients, greeted him with excitement. He brought gifts and jokes, and the hospital's usual routines bent to fit his presence. On those mornings, nurses swapped shifts or stayed late, and the rules about visitors seemed to blur. The staff had grown used to his unpredictable arrivals. The expectation was that everyone would make it work. In the diary, there is no accusation, only the phrase "overly familiar," which carries more weight in hindsight than it did at the time. For years, such moments passed without comment. Saville's status as a celebrity and benefactor offered a kind of permission. He was known to hospital administrators and sat on fundraising boards. His photograph hung in the corridor, a reminder of the money he helped raise. To question his behavior was to risk not just personal discomfort, but the goodwill and resources he brought with him. The nurse's entry reflects a process psychologists call the normalization of deviance. At first, an exception is made for a visitor who brings positive attention. Then, small rule bending becomes routine. Over time, the unusual becomes ordinary. Staff who might once have been uneasy about Saville's access to private areas or his interactions with patients learned to look the other way. Each small compromise was justified by the larger mission, raising funds, boosting morale, helping children feel special. For many nurses, the calculation was practical. Hospitals in the 1980s were under pressure, with staff shortages and growing demand. A high-profile supporter meant new equipment, extra volunteers, and a sense of pride. The risk of causing offense or being seen as ungrateful outweighed the vague discomfort of a boundary crossed. Junior staff watched senior colleagues accommodate Saville, and the message was clear. This was how things worked. The diary entry is not unique. Other staff records from the period mention Saville's presence in restricted areas, sometimes after regular visiting hours. These notes rarely express outright concern. Instead, they record the logistics: who signed him in, what time he left, which wards he visited. The system relied on trust, and Saville's reputation made him an exception to every rule. There were, of course, private conversations. Some nurses admitted years later that they felt uneasy when Saville lingered in the staff room or paid too much attention to certain patients. But in the absence of a clear incident, and with the weight of institutional approval behind him, few felt able to speak out. The cost of raising a question seemed higher than the cost of staying silent. The incremental acceptance of rule bending in healthcare settings is rarely dramatic. It happens in the margins, between patient charts and tea breaks, in the way visitor policies are quietly adjusted for special guests. The nurse's diary, with its brief mention and lack of follow-up, captures this process in real time. It is a record of how silence can take root, not through a single decision, but through a series of small, unremarkable choices, each one easier to justify than the last. By the time serious allegations surfaced decades later, the memory of these early warnings had faded. The diary entry remains, a quiet witness to what was seen, noted, and then absorbed into the routine of hospital life. For the nurse who wrote it, and for many others, the calculus of loyalty, fear, and self-preservation played out in the everyday details. The culture of silence did not announce itself. It grew, one overlooked moment at a time. A letter dated October 1994 sits in the BBC internal archives, filed under a category labeled simply as Staff Gossip. The author, a mid-level producer still early in their career, addressed it to Ian Stokes, head of program planning. The language in the letter is cautious, almost deferential. The writer describes having heard rumors that Mr. Saville makes advances towards younger staff at charity events and asks for guidance on how to handle such talk among colleagues. There is no accusation, no direct claim, just a request for advice couched in the careful phrasing of someone aware of the risks of speaking too plainly. The letter was never forwarded to human resources. Instead, it was placed in a file reserved for minor workplace chatter and left to gather dust. The decision to archive rather than investigate reflects more than bureaucratic inertia. It reveals the unwritten rules that governed newsroom life at the time. For many in BBC production teams, loyalty to the organization and to its most celebrated personalities was a matter of both professional pride and personal survival. Challenging a figure like Saville meant questioning the judgment of senior management, risking isolation from one's peers, and potentially jeopardizing future assignments. Within the production offices, the boundaries between personal relationships and professional obligations blurred. Saville's status as a fixture on flagship programs meant that producers, researchers, and junior staff often relied on his goodwill for access to coveted projects. The BBC internal culture prized stability and discretion. Unsubstantiated rumors, especially about a star, were seen as a threat to the group's cohesion. The implicit expectation was to keep such matters within the family. The language of the 1994 letter hints at the psychological pressures faced by those in the newsroom. The writer frames their concerns as a question, not a statement, and seeks reassurance rather than action. This is the language of self-censorship, where the fear of being labeled a troublemaker outweighs the discomfort of staying silent. The letter's careful tone suggests an acute awareness of the risks involved in raising sensitive topics. For a junior producer, the calculation was clear. Loyalty to the team and the institution offered safety, while speaking out could mean professional exile. The editorial culture of the time reinforced these instincts. Stories about high-profile talent were subject to layers of review, with legal and editorial gatekeepers scrutinizing every detail. Even the suggestion of impropriety by a senior presenter was enough to trigger a risk assessment, not of the behavior itself, but of the potential fallout for the corporation. The result was a form of institutional groupthink, where the desire to protect reputations and careers stifled open discussion. This process was not unique to the BBC. Across the media sector in the 1990s, career advancement depended on maintaining good relationships with influential figures. Junior staff were expected to observe, learn, and keep their heads down. The unwritten rule was clear: do not make waves. In this environment, rumors became background noise, acknowledged in private, dismissed in public, and quietly filed away when they threatened to surface. The 1994 letter stands as a small but telling artifact of this culture. It documents a moment when a member of the production team tried gingerly to raise a concern, only to have their words absorbed by the machinery of loyalty and self-preservation. The choice to file the letter under staff gossip was not just a bureaucratic decision, it was a signal to others that the safest path remained silence. For the producer who wrote it, and for many of their colleagues, the calculation was ongoing. Each day brought new reminders of where the boundaries lay. The cost of questioning a celebrated colleague was measured not just in professional risk, but in the subtle erosion of trust within the team. Over time, these small acts of self-censorship became routine. The newsroom learned to rationalize its silence, convincing itself that rumors were just that, unsubstantiated, unworthy of action, best left unspoken. The cost of breaking that silence was made clear, not through explicit threats, but through the quiet filing away of inconvenient questions. The 1994 letter is not an outlier. It is part of a pattern that repeated across departments and decades. It shows how institutional loyalty, career dependency, and the fear of ostracism combined to create an environment where silence was not just tolerated, but expected. On May 13, 1990, a formal complaint landed on the desk of Detective Superintendent Peter Wells at the Metropolitan Police. The log entry, released decades later under a Freedom of Information request, described a former patient at Bradford Royal Infirmary who reported inappropriate touching by a famous television personality. The record notes that Wells took the statement, entered the complaint into the official register, and then advised the complainant to seek private legal counsel. No further action was recorded. The file did not move up the chain. There was no referral to a specialist unit, no request for corroborating evidence, and no attempt to cross-check the allegation with hospital staff or charity trustees. The complaint remained a single line in a ledger, indistinguishable from routine calls about lost property or minor disputes. The Metropolitan Police log from that year is a study in bureaucratic detachment. Each case is given equal weight on the page, whether it involves a missing handbag or an allegation against a household name. In the margin beside the Saville complaint, a note in blue ink simply said, "Advised private action." The meaning is clear. The responsibility for pursuing justice is shifted back to the individual. The system itself is insulated from risk. No internal review followed. No senior officer signed off. The complaint was neither dismissed nor escalated. It was absorbed by the machinery of record-keeping, disappearing into a stack of unresolved files. For Detective Superintendent Wells, the decision to log but not act reflects a wider pattern in policing at the time. The expectation was that only the most clear-cut, corroborated allegations would trigger an investigation, especially when the accused was well known. The risk of pursuing a celebrity with all the attendant media scrutiny and legal exposure was weighed against the ambiguity of a single complaint. In the absence of hard evidence, the safest course was to document and defer. The logbook became both a record of concern and a shield against accountability. The Freedom of Information release that brought these entries to light decades later reveals more than a failure of follow-up. It illustrates how the diffusion of responsibility can become embedded in official procedure. Each actor in the chain, detective, supervisor, record keeper, can point to their own compliance with protocol. The complainant is left to navigate a system that appears open, but is, in practice, unresponsive. The advice to seek private counsel is not just a legal formality. It is a subtle signal that the institution will not intervene without overwhelming evidence or external pressure. Wells's log entry stands as a quiet indictment of systemic inertia. The decision not to act was not made in isolation. It was shaped by a culture that prized caution over confrontation, especially when faced with the reputation of a public figure. The record shows no malice, only the steady erosion of responsibility as it passes from one hand to the next. For the complainant, the result was silence. For the institution, the risk was managed, the file closed, the problem deferred. The complaint became another data point in a system designed to contain rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Social psychologist Professor Mark Allen begins with a simple observation. Silence is rarely just the absence of speech. In groups, especially those built on loyalty and reputation, silence can be a form of active participation. Groupthink, he explains, is the tendency for tightly knit circles to suppress dissent and prioritize harmony over truth. In the BBC's production teams, this meant that even vague suspicions about a star's behavior were often absorbed into a shared code of discretion. The group's need to maintain its own cohesion became more important than any single member's discomfort. Loyalty bias works alongside this pressure. Dr. Laura Murray, who has studied whistleblowing in large organizations, describes how people tend to protect those they see as part of their own group, even when it means ignoring clear warning signs. This bias is not just about friendship, it is about a collective identity. When Savile was praised as a national treasure, his colleagues internalized that image. Any challenge to his character felt like a challenge to the group itself. The discomfort that followed, cognitive dissonance, was often resolved by rationalizing what was seen or heard. Odd behavior became eccentricity. Boundary crossing was excused as part of the act. Loyalty and eccentricity shaped how events were framed. The fear of ostracism is just as powerful. In high-pressure workplaces, risking exclusion can mean the end of a career. Dr. Murray points to research showing that potential whistleblowers often calculate the social and professional costs of speaking up. The threat is not always explicit. Sometimes it is the subtle withdrawal of support, the loss of future assignments, or the cold shoulder from trusted colleagues. Within Savile's inner circle, those who might have questioned his conduct faced the risk of being labeled disloyal or difficult. The cost of breaking ranks was rarely spelled out, but it was understood by everyone. These mechanisms, groupthink, loyalty bias, and fear of ostracism, are not unique to the BBC or to Savile's era. They appear wherever close-knit groups protect their own. Groupthink is defined by psychologists as the drive for consensus at the expense of critical evaluation. Loyalty bias is the tendency to favor in-group members and reinterpret evidence to protect them. Fear of ostracism describes the anxiety that comes from risking exclusion, whether social or professional. Each mechanism reinforces the others, creating a web that can trap even well-intentioned people in silence. Professor Allen notes that this web is especially hard to break when authority figures command both admiration and institutional power. When the person at the center is seen as indispensable, the group's instinct is to close ranks. Dr. Murray adds that effective whistleblowing depends on more than just individual courage. It requires structures that support dissent and reduce the social cost of speaking out. Without those safeguards, silence becomes the path of least resistance. Understanding these psychological patterns does not excuse the choices made by Savile's friends and colleagues, but it does explain how silence can become routine, even in the face of troubling evidence. The same mechanisms that kept questions unasked in the BBC's corridors are found in other institutions where loyalty, fear, and self-preservation shape what is seen, what is said, and what is left unsaid. Operation Yewtree began in October 2012, when the Metropolitan Police joined forces with NSPCC to investigate allegations that had for decades remained scattered across separate files and institutions. The task force was assembled quickly, drawing detectives and child protection specialists from across London. Their mandate was clear: review every complaint, every witness statement, every rumor that had been quietly filed away or dismissed. What started as a review of a handful of cases soon became a national probe. Within weeks, the volume of testimonies grew far beyond initial expectations. By January 2013, Operation Yewtree investigators had reviewed over 400 accounts from survivors, hospital staff, former colleagues, and family members. Each testimony added a new layer to the timeline, revealing patterns that had gone unnoticed when complaints were handled in isolation. Some statements described incidents from the 1960s, others from as recently as the early 2000s. The complaints came from all corners of the UK: hospitals, care homes, television studios, and private residences. In many cases, victims described telling someone at the time, a nurse, a teacher, a BBC staff member. Yet, again and again, their accounts had been logged, filed, or quietly set aside. The Yewtree team worked through archived visitor logs, internal memos, and police records. Patterns began to emerge: dates and locations where Savile had been granted unsupervised access, instances where multiple complaints overlapped, and repeated references to the same institutional barriers. The aggregation of these scattered accounts made the scale of the harm undeniable. For the first time, the silence that had protected Savile was quantified. More than 200 alleged victims were identified in the initial stages, with the final count surpassing 400. Each testimony became a data point in a growing dossier, exposing not just individual acts of abuse, but the cost of years of collective inaction. The investigators themselves became part of the story. Their interviews, documented in official reports, describe the emotional toll of hearing so many similar accounts, stories that had been minimized or ignored for decades. The Yewtree operation forced institutions to confront the reality that silence did not mean ignorance. It meant that warnings had been missed, dismissed, or suppressed. The task force's findings would soon prompt a wave of independent reviews, but the immediate impact was clear. The sheer number of victims revealed what silence, when sustained by loyalty, fear, and self-preservation, can allow to happen. In June 2016, Dame Janet Smith released her independent review, exposing how the BBC's internal culture allowed Jimmy Savile to operate unchecked. Drawing on survivor accounts, staff interviews, and internal documents, Smith revealed a workplace shaped by deference to authority and fear of reprisal, where silence became routine. Her findings went beyond individual failings, pointing to a system that discouraged speaking out and protected reputations over people. Smith's recommendations demanded structural change. She called for an independent public inquiry, free from the BBC's oversight, to ensure transparency and public trust. A statutory whistleblower and safeguarding framework was mandated, giving staff direct, confidential channels to report abuse or misconduct outside the BBC's chain of command. Anonymous reporting became a requirement, with every complaint logged, tracked, and subject to external audit. The review insisted that no concern could be quietly dismissed or hidden within a single department. A new BBC Safeguarding Board was established, reporting directly to the Director General. Its role was to oversee all safeguarding policies, review complaints, and prevent any department from shielding wrongdoing. Regular cultural audits and mandatory training on power dynamics, consent, and groupthink were introduced. All on-air and production staff now faced compulsory background checks, closing gaps that once allowed influential figures to avoid scrutiny. Implementation reports from the BBC Trust tracked a 12-point action plan. An independent safeguarding commissioner was appointed, and annual public reporting on safeguarding metrics became standard practice. The whistleblowing hotline expanded to accept anonymous digital submissions, and trauma-informed support was embedded across all divisions. A behavioral risk register flagged individuals whose status might suppress complaints. Psychological safety workshops became routine, building an expectation that staff would speak up. By 2022, external audits of safeguarding systems were required every 3 years, with results published for public review. Anonymous reporting and cross-institution complaint sharing broke down barriers that once stalled action. Independent oversight ensured no leader or department could shield a colleague from scrutiny. These reforms recognized that ending silence requires more than policy. It demands a shift in how loyalty, fear, and self-preservation are addressed throughout the institution. Silence rarely protects only the guilty. Today, institutions still reward loyalty over honesty, and fear of consequence still shapes what people choose to see or ignore. The psychology of silence is not history, it's a living system, reinforced by self-preservation and quiet compromise. Until these patterns are broken, warning signs will always risk being buried by the very networks meant to expose them. What would you do if the truth risked everything?